Oh, yay. I have been anticipating discussing this topic for a while. This is a video I've been holding off. Not for a lack of content or knowledge, because, oh, yes, I am very much in tune to magazines. But because it's a little overwhelming. And I thought about doing two versions of this video, or two parts. Part one, my personal history with magazines and reminiscing on which ones did I read, what was out there, what was the world like when we had magazines before we had the internet, etc. And then maybe the second part, my actual real world experience working at and writing for magazines, because I did, for a brief period, get to write for magazines. 1000% magazines you've never heard of, because one, they're not in publication anymore. Excuse me. God damn it. And two, they were hyper-local in the first place. But, still, I did get that brief experience. So we'll see where this video goes. If it turns out I need to do a second video and go more in-depth into one or the other, I will. So what the hell are magazines? Magazines, for those who are younger than 30, are websites that they print on glossy paper that they ship to your door or sell at the place called the newsstand, which is a foreign word to you, I'm sure. But it's basically that rack of paper at your department store where they sell basically magazines and comic books if you're lucky, and crossword puzzles if nothing else. Once upon a time, before the rise and dominance of the World Wide Web, magazines ruled the world. That is not an exaggeration, basically. It is a little hyperbole, yes, but they were everywhere. And there was literally a magazine for any topic you could think of, no matter how niche it was. Now, separate to the magazine is a smaller circulation independent publication known as the fanzine. That's a whole other topic for another day. I mentioned them here briefly because that is just a reminder that there was topics on anything you could imagine. Your mainstream magazines came in all kinds of varieties. You had People Magazine, Us Weekly, Teen Beat Magazine. Those were your celebrity gossip and news magazines. You had your Newsweek. You had your National Geographic. You had your Science Magazine. And Time and Time Life and Life Magazine. Those were your various, we'll say, educational type magazines. You had your kids-focused things like Highlights. I mentioned in a previous video, 321 Contact. There were maybe others. I think there was a Sesame Street magazine at one point in time. I'm pretty sure there was a Nickelodeon magazine at one point in time, because I think I had an issue of it at one point in time, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah. There were a shit ton of computer and video game magazines. PC Gamer, PC World, Game Informer. There was GameSpot, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. There was Nintendo Power, obviously. Sega Visions. There was Electronic Gaming Monthly. That was right here. That's the one I read. And there were a variation of others. Game Pro was a magazine. There might have been others. I can't remember them all. There were toy and comic book collectible magazines. There was Toy Fair and Wizard. Wizard magazine was focused mostly on comics, but it also had segments devoted to action figures and trading cards and video games. And then Toy Fair was a little more in-depth in the action figures and toys and collectibles. There may have been one or two other comic book themed magazines. There's probably was one or two trading card themed magazines, but I don't remember. Plenty of sports magazines. The big one is Sports Illustrated, obviously. There were dirty magazines that you had before the adult websites like Playboy and Hustler, etc. And then you had random stuff like, you know, Model Trains Monthly, and you had, like, Guns and Ammo. You had Better Homes and Gardens. You had all kinds of shit. I can't even think of them all off the top of my head. There were so many fucking magazines. GQ, I believe, was a magazine. There were so many. They just were everywhere. So your standard magazine typically followed more or less the same format. You had a very busy cover that was desperately screaming, "Buy me right now, look at all this shit that's inside." So many headlines, so much random shit. Screaming, "Buy me right now." Once you opened it up, you were immediately presented with advertisements. Once you flipped through the advertisements, you got to the index page, which basically told you which pages the various features and articles you were looking for could be found. There was usually an intro, a letter from the editor type thing, followed by a letters to the editor or a letters page, fan mail page, where they would print letters that people sent in. Probably edited, I would imagine. After that, they would get into the various features. Features came in different formats. You had in-depth features, you had brief outlooks, you had previews, reviews, you had, you know, top 10 best whatevers, you had tips and tricks articles, you had helpful hints and what we would today call life hacks, things like that. Stuff like that. And then as the magazine went on, again, infested with advertisements, because that's how they made money. As they went on, you'd start to get into the lesser quality content, like your like, we went to the convention you couldn't go to and took pictures types of things, your photo galleries, stuff like that. And then at the back of the magazines, you would have some type of index type thing. Your comic book magazines, your index was the price guide. Same with your toy magazines. Your video game magazines, the index was usually like leaderboards of who were the top, you know, who had the high scores or whatever. Maybe it would be like hints and tips and tricks and things like that, cheat codes, etc. And then it would end the magazine with a few more ads, and then usually another, you know, editorial type page where they would sum up what you just read and what you can look for next month or week or issue. Most magazines were monthly or bi-monthly. Bi-monthly either means every other month or twice a month. A handful of magazines like Us Weekly and TV Guide, as two notable exceptions, were weekly magazines. There were not a ton of weekly magazines, but they did exist. They were usually thinner and on lesser quality paper because they had to churn them out quicker. Typically, the lead-up time from pitch meeting to publication is 3 months for an article. So magazines had to plan out their articles ahead of time so that their writers could have time to do the work, you know, do the investigating or research or interviews or whatever they had to do, and then, you know, put it all together, acquire the photographs however they had to, either stock photos or send a photographer or take pictures themselves or whatever they had to do, give it to the paginator, as we call them in the business, and they would put it all together, and then the various teams of editors and proofreaders would, you know, polish it, you know, set it up, send it to the printers. They would print it, put it in the package, ship it to your house, and then, or to the newsstand, and then you were good to go. Like I said, the typical lead up was 3 months. So, for example, E3 would take place in June, But the E3 issue would come out in like late August, early September, where it had all the everything we learned from E3. They would occasionally sneak in like previews and things like that in the July and August issues if they could, if they were able to get that stuff prepared ahead of time or whatever, but it would the full in-depth coverage would come later after they had time to put it all together. Because again, like I said, you had to kind of plan things out ahead of time. Because you had to work with the advertisers to know which page their ad was going to be on, how big of a ad it was going to be, quarter page, half page, full page, 2-page spread, whatever. Was it going to be full color, black and white, glossy, regular paper, whatever? You have to have them options so that they could, budget accordingly. And then you had to figure out what pages the ads went on and then build the content around that. Because in all publications, when you're building your publication, be it a comic book or a magazine or a newspaper, you put the ads on the page first. Because you do not want to miss an ad, because that is a very costly mistake. Magazines I read. Briefly. I did not read Nintendo Power back when, in the 90s, when it was the thing. At that time, I was reading Electronic Gaming Monthly, also known as EGM, and its weekly sister publication, EGM2, and its, I believe, quarterly sister publication, Tips and Tricks magazine. I was also reading Sega Visions until that publication ceased. I was also reading Game Pro, but also occasionally Game Informer, and one other one I can't remember what it was called. I'm sorry. I was also reading TV Guide pretty fucking regularly. I was also reading People and Cosmo pretty regularly. Occasionally I would read a teen magazine, but not Teen Beat. I didn't like Teen Beat. Occasionally I would read a National Geographic or one of those family of magazines. Never, ever, ever, ever a Sports Illustrated or one of the dirty books. Never, not once. I've never touched or seen a Playboy in my life, and I probably never will. Not into it. What else? I used to read Wizard magazine, and there was another comic book magazine I used to read, but I can't remember what it was called. And then I did also used to read Toy Fair magazine as well. Those were pretty regular. Occasionally, on rare occasions, if the cover caught my interest, or it included a freebie, I would pick up a copy of The Source magazine or Rolling Stone, maybe a copy of PC Gamer if it came with a demo disc of something. Something like that. I never had any interest in official Xbox or PlayStation magazines, and once I bought a GameCube, I did start reading Nintendo Power regularly, but prior to that, I wasn't, full-on loyal to Nintendo. I was pretty much Sega first, Nintendo second, PC third, and then fourth place PlayStation. But once I got a GameCube, for a long, long while, I was Nintendo first. Fuck Sega because they basically threw in the towel. And I was still pissed off at Sony, so I didn't have any interest in PlayStation, and I was never into Xbox. And then if I'm at the waiting room, dentist office, doctor's office, etc., etc., I'd pick up whatever random magazine was on the table that looked interesting and then flip through it until they called my name. And that's pretty much it. Now let's briefly, hopefully, talk about my time working in magazines. Because it wasn't very, very long. It was only about 3 years. The first magazine I ever got an article published in was a very local, hyper-local magazine called the North Texas Best Times. It was one of those free magazines that the newspaper publisher put in their newspaper free of charge, included as a bonus publication. I think it was quarterly, so it was every 3 months. And then they would also go around town and leave stacks of them at businesses and places of public access where people could just grab a copy. So I published a few articles in those. Because it was called North Texas Best Times, it was a lifestyle magazine. Most of my articles were like, a day on the lake, and I would go out on the boat with the, what are they called? Tour guide or whatever, and they would drive me around the lake, and I would take pictures and ask them questions and do a whole feature on things you can do at the lake. Or I did things like, I don't know, just stuff like that. Just outdoorsy stuff like that, stuff that was relevant to that market. That same publication, that same firm, published a handful of other quarterly or annual magazine publications. I also published articles for those as well. But I'm not going to list them because they're just your standard things, But anyways, yeah. A lot of local news features. And then I went to work at a daily newspaper that was a part of the Gannett family. Well, originally, it was a part of Gatehouse, and then Gannett bought out Gatehouse. But anyways, while I was working there, we had a hyper-local magazine that was for upscale, I will say, wealthy individuals in the community. I will not name this magazine for two reasons. One, NDAs. You're not rich enough to own a copy of it, so you'll never find one, because it was an exclusive magazine we only gave to rich people. There was no public access. You could not get a subscription, and we had to hand select you for inclusion on our list of recipients of this magazine. It was a very upscale magazine, very hyper local. Which meant we would attract the more, let's just say, upscale advertisers that were targeting the affluent individuals. And so that was our format. This was also I believe it was a monthly publication, but we had a dedicated staff whose job it was specifically to put together this magazine. But they also borrowed from the news staff. Basically, if you, whatever your beat was, had an article that was interesting enough that you could modify to fit in the magazine, they would instruct you to do so, and you would. And that would count as part of your regular output. And instead of running that article in the newspaper, it would run in the magazine. Those are the only magazines I have experience working for. Now, the monthly magazine... Well, I'll backpedal. Let's backpedal to the quarterly magazine. Because it came out every quarter, that means every 3 months. So we only did 4 issues a month. Basically, we did a winter issue, a spring issue, a fall issue, and a summer issue. Basically. So... the winter issue came out in January, so we started working on it in October. And then we would work on it through December, while also working on the newspaper and other projects on the side as needed. And then in January, we would put it together and ship it, and get it out, publish it, print it, distribute it. And then we would immediately start working on the fall or spring issue, which I believe came out in April. And then we did the summer issue, which I think came out in July. And then the fall issue would come out, I believe, in September or October, if I'm not mistaken. So, we didn't have a ton of time. You'd think 3 months is forever, but this is a full magazine with 16 full-color pages of content, and your standard newspaper article, like your standard headline, photograph, and then 600 to 1,000 words or whatever, your standard newspaper article would only take up about half a page to maybe 3/4 of a page in the magazine. It wasn't enough. So you had to produce a lot of content. And you couldn't just do photo galleries. We had to do full featured articles. So it was a lot of work. Now, the newspaper that put out this publication had 2 offices, because they printed 3 weekly newspapers covering 3 separate communities. So we had a team of 6 staff producing content for this magazine. So the expectation was basically each staff had to do 2 to 3 articles for the magazine, more or less, on top of their weekly assignments. So it was a lot of work, like I said, because you had to find the time, usually on the weekends, which either meant overtime or you were working off the clock, depending on the assignment. Which it was okay because, the perks, you're getting to do a lot of cool stuff. So it's like, all right, I'll go spend the day, with this rich person who's going to give me a tour of all his mansions and let me take pictures of his expensive cars and write about how much money he has. Okay, as long as he's buying me lunch, I'm good, because he usually did. Things like that. Now let's go back to the monthly magazine that we produced at the daily newspaper. This one was way more work, because this was not a 16-page publication. This was a full, 48 to 64 pages publication. It was thick. It was huge. And they were full. It looked like a full magazine. Not like the paper thin pieces of shit you find today. I mean, I'm talking like a mid-90s magazine. Now, we could do photo galleries, but it had to be a photo gallery of a gala or red carpet type event where you would see rich people at their best. And I mean their best. But this was rare. Those gala type events didn't happen often, and so you couldn't get away with too many of those. And your articles had to be assigned to you by not your news editor, who was your immediate boss, but by the magazine editor, who was also known as the features editor or special publications editor, who was technically above the news editor in the newsroom. So it was like a separate job. So you had 2 people you had to answer to. You had to turn in your daily assignments to the news editor, and you had to get assignments from the magazine editor, and you never knew when they were going to use an article. Sometimes you would spend 3 months working on an article, and it wouldn't come out for 6 months to a year later. Sometimes you would bust your ass and get an article done today, and then it would show up in 3 months. Very rare was it pressing that you did something immediately, urgently, and it ran in that immediate next issue. That was very rare. Very rare. Because like I said, they had to be planned out 3 months in advance so that they knew what the hell they were doing. When I worked at the weekly paper, I didn't have a beat. I was just staff writer, so I did whatever I was told to do. Sports, lifestyles, crime, emergencies, breaking news, whatever. When I worked at the daily paper, I climbed the ladder. I started out as a temp from the sent to them from the temp agency, so I was basically non-staff contributor. And then I worked my way up. After 3 months, I was brought on staff as a non-beat general reporter. So I had no beat. I was just a general purpose reporter. I would be assigned different tasks every day. And then after a couple of months of that, I was given the education beat, which, oh my god, I loved the education beat. That was probably the most fun I've ever had in a job in my entire life. Because it isn't just all school board meetings, although it is definitely school board meetings, for sure. But, it's the fun stuff, and not sports. That's a separate department. It was going to one of the local elementary schools and doing an article on the 3rd graders that are writing computer program to program robots they built with their hands. Really awesome stuff like that. Just really fun stuff. yeah, occasionally stuff like covering the spelling bee, or, like I said, the school board meetings, whatever. And just, like, your standard back-to-school articles, your standard, different, highlighting and spotlighting the different academic clubs, things like that. And if there was any breaking news, covering that as well, assuming it wasn't a school shooting, in which case it was no longer in the hands of the education reporter, then it went to the breaking news or criminal reporter, depending on, day one, breaking news reporter, and then follow-ups would be the criminal reporter, the crime reporter, or the criminal justice reporter, once it got to the courts. So that was out of my hands at that point. I didn't get to cover school shootings. Fortunately, we didn't have any school shootings during my time at that newspaper. So, yay, I guess. Knock on wood. Okay. And then I got upgraded to government reporter, which is a very big deal. Government reporter is one of the top tier news reporter levels. It's like the job every news reporter covets. The three jobs every news reporter wants to do, depending on their interest, is either government reporter, entertainment reporter, or sports reporter. Now, some people like to do lifestyles. Some people like to do, crime and stuff like that. But, government reporters, it's one of the coveted jobs people want. Because at that level, you're talking to powerful people, politicians, not just mayors, but the governor, the county commissioner, the district attorney, the county judge, at all levels. You're talking to political candidates, you're going to city council meetings, you're going to planning and zoning commission meetings, you're going to political rallies, et cetera, et cetera. You're getting to do the exciting, important stuff. That's the beat I had the most fun doing the education stuff, because those stories were fun, but the most important work I did was as a government reporter, and that was the most fulfilling work I did, because I did a lot of good stuff as a government reporter. I loved that beat. So, throughout all of that, I still had to do my magazine articles. And I could be 3 months deep into an investigation into corruption in the fire department, as an example. Doing, investigations and submitting FOIAs for documents and everything else, and trying to find a source who will talk, or find somebody who's willing to slip up or something. During that, you got to stop and do an article on what's the best wine in town and who sells it and how do you get it, or something to that effect. So it was a constant barrage of stress. I had more photographs published in the magazines than I did in the newspaper, just by volume, because your typical news article, unless it's a full in-depth feature or a sports page story, your standard news article has 1 or 2 photos at most. A feature can have a 3rd or 4th photo depending on how in-depth it is, but still it's usually 1 or 2. Your magazine article has between 3 to 5 photographs standard, sometimes as many as 7 or 8, unless it's like a full photo spread or photo gallery, in which case you're looking at 20 to 30 photographs. And I did a couple of good photo galleries. I did get to go and hobnob with the 1%ers at a couple of gala events and at least one red carpet event. So yeah, I got to do some of that fun stuff, taking pictures of celebrities and rich people being obnoxious about their money, and then just taking pictures of them and putting it on the, in the magazine, so people at home could be like, I wish I was rich. Except the only people reading the magazine were rich people, so I guess it was, I wish I was richer? I guess? I don't know. Anyways, it is what it is. that's all I have to say about magazines today. Maybe I'll do a revisited down the road, but that's all I have. Stay cool.